So now we're going to look at important ASP.NET controls that are used all the time. So first of them are buttons, and buttons respond to simple click events on web pages. So they can also trigger certain command events in more complex data controls. So for instance, buttons can trigger addition of new item, it's updating of existing item, deletion, and so on. There are different types of buttons. So the simple ones are where you specify input type as button. Those are the typical, say, submit button on a form. Image buttons that are they have type equals image. They're slightly different, and there are also link buttons, which are essentially plain hyperlinks. So they render like anchors, but they act as buttons. And because of that changed behavior, there is some JavaScript involved to make hyperlinks behave like buttons. So there are other properties of buttons that are very interesting, such as command names. So for instance, we can assign buttons different actions, and in more complex data controls such as table, those commands will trigger certain behaviors. So for instance, we can specify that some button is a delete button, and in a table, so once user clicks that button, it will delete a current item in table, and so on. So they can be used to execute certain SQL statements that will retrieve the data, update the data, and so on. Link buttons are, as mentioned, slightly different because they're rendered as hyperlinks using a tag, and but their target is not any particular resource or page, but actually JavaScript code that will execute some client-side code to communicate with server, so the update to the page happens. So if you look at this example, so in design view in the center, we see that how table control looks in design view. So there are a template for those two buttons, and you can customize how they appear and what commands they're associated with. If you look at the source view, you will see, for instance, that this edit button has text edit, but also that its command that it will execute will be edit command. So because it's contained within grid view, which is a table, more complex table component, it will execute deletion of a particular item. When we look at link buttons, you'll see, for instance, that the link button, if you look at the source view, that its href is JavaScript code and do postback function, and that do postback function is defined on the same ASP page up slightly earlier, and what it will do, it will trigger submission of the form and update of that page. So in a sense, it achieves the same result as a traditional button, but through hyperlink. So if you look at this do postback function, you'll see the last line says form.submit. It actually executes the same thing that will happen if you press the regular button. Also, you have hyperlinks in ASP.NET. So instead of anchors, simple anchors, you now use ASP hyperlink control, and it will have a URL either as an attribute. It will have URL as a navigate URL attribute, but the text itself can be provided either contained in a tag or as an attribute called text. So you can do both ways. As with regular hyperlinks, you can specify relative or absolute URLs. So if you specify fully with HTTP, it will be a URL to a particular website. If you specify relatively, it will be starting from this particular ASP page, or you can start with tilde, which will be an absolute, indicate an absolute URL from the root of the server. There are also drop-down lists, and you can use them to provide a list of features, a list of values that are pre-populated. So you can add them. There's small smart task panel called Edit Items, so you can add items that you want to any of those drop-down list component controls. And there are different properties associated with them. So for instance, what is the particularly currently selected index and selected value? What is the name of the data source that's invoked, if it was invoked? If you have a data source, what field in those objects will be used to provide text value, and which one will be used to provide the value in the drop-down. So you can use them, typically those hard-coded ones, for something that's rarely changed. So for instance, days of week, states, countries, and so on. Or you can make them using data sources more interactive. So the list of values that's being shown will be obtained from the database. So that way you don't need to change code at all. You just enter a new record in database. So here you see that in browser it will be rendered as a simple drop down of 3 values. And how they are represented in ASP, they're represented with certain text. So those 3 strings: data modeling, Java programming, and intelligent system technologies. But the value will be 3 numbers. So users won't see those numbers. They will typically be IDs of database records and so on. So what will be sent to browser will be this HTML code, which will be just a regular HTML.